Donald Trump ditches the deal. Could he be igniting an arms race with Tehran? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement. Well, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal was one of Donald Trump's central campaign promises. But making good on that pledge triggered a chain reaction of criticism around the world. Minutes after Trump's announcement, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani threatened to enrich even more uranium than before. Former U.S. President Barack Obama, who helped negotiate the deal, called the decision misguided and warned it could hurt upcoming talks with North Korea. And in a sign that the U.S. is pitting itself against its closest allies, the U.K., France, and Germany issued a joint statement saying they're prepared to move ahead with their own Iran deal. So will pulling out of the agreement make the U.S. safer or more isolated? Here's Christine Petrovolakis.
From the start, U.S. President Donald Trump had threatened to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions I've ever seen drawn by anybody, ever. And I mean never.
Now he's made good on that promise.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime.
But even with the U.S. pulling out and imposing new economic sanctions on Iran, it doesn't mean the deal is dead just yet. The UK, France, and Germany are also parties to the agreement designed to prevent Iran from making a nuclear weapon, and they say they'll work to keep it.
The European Union is determined to preserve it. We expect the rest of the international community to continue to do its part to guarantee that it continues to be fully implemented for the sake of our own collective security.
Russia says it too would continue its efforts to keep the deal alive. For now, Iran says it will remain in the deal that it signed with 6 world powers in 2015. Under the pact, Tehran agreed to scale back its uranium enrichment substantially in return for ending some of the sanctions that had crippled its economy. It wants to preserve what's formally known as a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA.
رایزنی‌ها، هماهنگی‌های لازم و مذاکرات لازم رو انجام بده. اگر در پایان این مهلت و زمان کوتاه ما به این نتیجه رسیدیم که با همکاری 5 کشور می توانیم همه آنچه در برجام خواست ملت ایران بوده به دست آوریم.
But Iran has warned that should the deal collapse altogether, it would restart nuclear activities and throw out UN inspectors, all in a matter of weeks.
Iran's leaders will naturally say that they refuse to negotiate a new deal. They refuse, and that's fine. I'd probably say the same thing if I was in their position. But the fact is, they are going to want to make a new and lasting deal.
Trump plans to use sanctions to force Iran to renegotiate the deal on American terms. But critics say it could backfire, increasing the risk of confrontations that go far beyond flag burning in Iran's parliament. Iran has one of the Middle East's largest missile programs, and some of its weapons have the range to strike Israel.
Since the deal, we've seen the Iran aggression grow every day in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, and most of all, in Syria, where Iran is trying to establish military bases from which to attack Israel.
Just after the U.S. pullout was officially announced, Israelis in the occupied Golan Heights were put on alert after reports of irregular activity of Iranian forces in Syria. New U.S. sanctions against Iran will include punishing those who do business with Iran by blocking access to the U.S. marketplace.
Any nation that helps Iran in its quest for nuclear weapons could also be strongly sanctioned.
And several European countries with investments already in Iran won't be the only ones to lose out.
Even without sanctions, we're miserable. Really, the pressure's from every side. All my friends are leaving Iran, and this is not a place we can stay in.
Others across the region have also been left to wonder what could happen. Could Trump's decision to pull out of the agreement bring even more conflict to the Middle East? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel now, and in London, we have Mehrad Khonsari. He is a former Iranian diplomat and senior consultant for the Paris-based Iranian Center for Policy Studies. In Washington, Thomas Countryman. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation under President Barack Obama. And joining us from Philadelphia, Michael Johns, a former White House speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush and a co-founder of the conservative Tea Party movement. Thanks, all three of you, so much for joining us. Mehrad, let me start with you. Trump said pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal isn't just good for America. It's good for the people of Iran because it is bad for the Iranian government. Do you think that's true?
I don't believe that to be the case. The people of Iran were hoping that in the aftermath of the signing of this agreement, that that would serve as a first step for Iran's gradual reintegration into the international community. They were hopeful that funds, money would start rolling into the country, technology will come, there would be jobs, that the economy would improve, inflation would be sort of dealt with, and issues of that nature. Now, they are the victims of this situation going from bad to worse, and for their miseries to be sort of becoming prolonged. And in the case of those Iranians who thought that perhaps President Trump was intending or was bent on trying to promote regime change and were hopeful that this signified, something in that direction, it was clear in his message, at the end of his message, when he said that he appealed to the Iranian leaders that if they were ever ready for wanting to make a new deal, that he would be ready, willing, and able to sort of embark on a new course leading to a new, you might say, more broader deal with them. So prospects of regime change can hardly be advanced if he is in negotiation with the current ruling establishment. So overall, I don't think that any Iranian, for patriotic reasons alone, to sort of be bullied in this direction, it can be pleased, even if there are aspects of President Trump's message that might be appealing to them.
Okay. Michael Johns, let me ask you. First of all, do you agree with Trump that it will be good for the Iranian people? And I mean, ultimately, does it even matter to the American public if it serves Iran or not? Because it's America first, as far as many of Trump's supporters are concerned.
Right. First and foremost, the deal was horrible and horribly constructed in every respect, and really placed Iran on a path to nuclear weapons development, in addition to lifting sanctions and affording this regime, which is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, vast billions of dollars. I do not believe that this agreement was supported by the Iranian people, and that's not a subjective view. There's been lots of statements that have come out of opposition organizations and figures from Iran that have celebrated and supported President Trump's decision. A lot of internal support that has gotten out, even in the last 24 hours, applauding this agreement. This was an agreement not even between the government of the United States. It was an agreement really between one singular president and an undemocratic, totalitarian regime that is repressing rights and fomenting chaos and terrorism throughout the region. So getting rid of this agreement ultimately is beneficial for the world. It's beneficial for security interests of the United States and our allies and the region. It's been supported by many Arab governments throughout the region. And it's ultimately beneficial to the people of Iran because it places the people of Iran and our relationship with them above this regime that does not represent them.
Okay. Thomas Countryman, if I can, I'd like to move the conversation a little forward with you. One of the other points that was raised here is that pulling out of this agreement actually pits the United States against its very closest allies. And now we have the European Union saying, we will preserve this deal for the sake of our own collective security. So where does this leave the United States now on the international front if it's made enemies, in a sense, with its closest allies?
Well, first of all, this was not a deal just between the United States and Iran. There were 7 countries that were partners, including the 3 most important allies of the United States, Britain, Germany, and France. The decision by President Trump to violate the deal, which is a more accurate word than to say to withdraw, leaves 6 countries that are still committed to the deal. And I hope that they will remain committed because it is in the interests of the U.S. and of regional security and in the interest of keeping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon that this deal be upheld. I share the same concern that the President and all of our friends in Europe and all of our friends in the Middle East have about Iran's destabilizing activities. The President has chosen a course of putting maximum economic pressure on Iran as a means of trying to change that behavior. There's a legitimate disagreement as to whether that's the most effective means to change behavior, or can you build on the agreement that is working to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons and extend your cooperation, negotiations, deals to other areas. And that's where we come to all the other side effects that I think the President has not fully considered. Number one is, as you mentioned, a direct conflict between the United States and its most important allies in Europe.
Right. And
with the President's threat to sanction not just the regime, but European companies as well.
And I mean, Thomas, if you can, speak briefly, if you can, on how those sanctions could actually work. You're saying that the European allies should stick with this deal as best they can, but if the threat of sanctions is there, and that threat is obviously very real, how could that even work?
Well, I'm not certain it would work. The decision by the President to violate the deal does not in itself kill the JCPOA, but it is a very severe injury to the agreement. I think what's important for especially the Europeans is to say we believe in sticking to commitments and agreements that we have made, and we will stand up in defense of an agreement that is working, that has removed 90% of Iran's enriched uranium, removed 75% of its centrifuges, taken us much further along a path that ensures Iran will never get there. It's important for Europe's credibility to stand up in defense of the deal.
Perhaps it is, but Michael Johns, let me ask you, I mean, the United States has done this, and Trump will stick by it. So tell us, how far is the United States, should the United States be willing to go to punish its European allies for breaking the sanctions, not just that are already there, but the sanctions that will come, that will punish their businesses for going forward with the deals they've already made under the agreement that was signed in 2015?
Well, I don't think there's been a definitive decision yet by the 3 predominant European signatories of this. We'll work closely with them in an attempt to restructure an agreement that actually prohibits, not for 10 years, but into perpetuity, the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. And hopefully that can be done. If it cannot be done, however, and this has been certainly the case, largely it's been taken with North Korea as well, then you need tough, universal, broadly applied sanctions and a position of unequivocal intolerance for the development of nuclear weapons. This, by the way, I think it was a great intellectual question when the agreement was signed as to what sort of effect it would have on Iran's behavior in the world. And many of us listened a little bit incredulously to President Obama's prediction that it would improve those engagements. It did just the opposite. The reality is terrorist activity throughout the world with Iran's involvement has accelerated, not decelerated. Their engagement in all sorts of malicious activity, anti-American rhetoric, direct conflict with the United States in several respects has accelerated. So the agreement did not have the intended effect on Iran's behavior. It would have been intriguing, I think, if that had happened. We may not have had the development that we did yesterday. But I think it's very consistent with Iran's underlying position.
Let me ask Mehrdad about that point. I mean, it is fair. Critics of the deal, Mehrdad, have said that since it was signed in 2015, we've seen an even more aggressive and militarily active Iran in the Middle East. We look at Yemen, Syria, Iraq, even Lebanon. Has the deal emboldened Iran since 2015, or would Iran really have been doing this anyway?
I think that the deal has nothing to do with any of these issues that this gentleman is talking about. The deal was supposed to curtail Iran's nuclear activities, stop the spread of proliferation in the region, which it has succeeded in doing. There is discussion about the fact that the sunset clause is something disagreeable, but there is no indication in any part of this deal that once this deal comes to a conclusion that Iran can resume where it left off and go after a nuclear deal. And many of these European countries who were in direct negotiation with Iran over this particular issue were adamant that some sort of talk should begin within the parameters of the current JCPOA to ensure against such an outcome once we reach the end of the line. But when you talk about malign influence or Iran's, first of all, Iran being the largest state sponsor of terrorism, first you have to remind your audiences that the problem that we are facing today is not with state sponsors of terrorism, but with a non-state. ISIS is not a state. Al-Qaeda is not a state, according to all the American intelligence organizations and, government officials. They are the ones that are the main problems. And also, when it comes to malign influence, I mean, I have been a critic of the Iranian regime for the past 40 years, and there is no way that I in any way validate the way that they have acted. But nobody can claim to have a monopoly on virtue and monopoly on good behavior. Problems in the Middle East that exist today, the wars in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon and Yemen, they were not instigated by Iran. They were all instigated by other people who left, who started something, then left, created a vacuum, created this mayhem from which the Iranian regime has been able to benefit. Now, I think that there's a legitimate reason to discuss these things with them, but you don't discuss these issues by sort of relinquishing the moral high ground and giving them the opportunity to have the support of the international community over failure on the part of yourself.
Okay, Thomas, let me ask you this. I mean, my own observation is that the last time we saw this kind of discord between the United States and its European allies over a foreign policy issue was when France and Germany in particular disagreed very strongly about where the U.S. was going in the lead up to the war in Iraq. Does the U.S. want to be there again? Does it want to be that much at odds with its most important allies on the planet?
Well, clearly, most of the United States does not want to be there. The latest public opinion surveys show that more than 60% of Americans believe that the U.S. should have stayed within the JCPOA. But you're right that I see echoes that concern me. History does not repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And what we're seeing is, again, a misuse of intelligence to make claims about weapons programs that simply do not exist. And we see one of the key actors, Mr. Bolton, who was one of the primary advocates for the war in Iraq and one of the primary misusers of intelligence information, and one who has spoken and written repeatedly about the need for the U.S. to take military action against Iran, is again in a position of power. And that concerns me greatly, because I do see scenarios under which by a series of missteps, provocations, and counter-provocations starting from either side, we could again find ourselves in a disastrous conflict in the Middle East, just as we did in 2003. Okay. And please don't forget one thing. The number one event that has done more to increase Iran's influence in the Middle East, more than any other event, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Michael Johns, do you see any of the same parallels that Thomas has pointed out there?
Not really, no, because the operating assumption with that argument is that we're in some status quo, amicable relationship with Iran right now. The reality is they just provided missiles that were launched at Riyadh. They were funding greatly Hezbollah and Hamas, which are destabilizing the region. They have prohibited our inspections in multiple ways, both prohibiting us from looking at military facilities in Iran where they logically would develop nuclear weapons, providing weeks.
But the IAEA has had full access, Michael.
Which you would only do. Just to finish, if you would only do that if you were trying to conceal weapons development. So really, what we're looking at right now is potentially restructuring, hopefully, an agreement that actually does preclude Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And part of that, the spirit of that agreement, maybe not the technical components of it, but the spirit of it, should include some degree of improvement in our relationship with that government and that government's rethinking of its behavior.
Thomas, very quickly, I mean, we're hearing Michael refer to the potential restructuring of the agreement, but it was interesting when I heard Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts say that actually Trump has just burnt down the house when he could have just remodeled the kitchen. So is there still potential for restructuring this deal so that all can get back on board?
There may be, but I've heard no strategy whatsoever from the White House about how to do that. And the difficulty with making a new agreement is that you make agreements with people that you trust. If the United States, under President Trump, develops the habit of repealing and not replacing, as it's done domestically on a few issues, as it did with the Paris Climate Agreement, and now it's done with the JCPOA, it's hard for me to argue to any world leader that making a deal with Donald Trump is worth the paper that it's printed on. U.S. credibility has been destroyed, and as an American diplomat for more than 30 years, it's shocking to me to see that Iran has more credibility in this instance than the United States does. Okay,
Thomas Countryman, I'll have to give you the last word because very unfortunately we are completely out of time for this segment. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. And we'll take a short break, but stay with us because Israel's former Knesset speaker and peace activist, Avram Burg, will join us to discuss Israel's position on the Iran nuclear deal, as well as the state of Israel's liberal opposition. Plus, now that the Basque separatist movement ETA has disbanded, Spain debates whether the former fighters should go home or go to prison.
Israel fully supports President Trump's bold decision today to reject the disastrous nuclear deal with the terrorist regime in Tehran.
Well, Israel has been one of the only supporters of President Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. Over the past decade, the Israeli government has moved further and further to the right, eventually finding a seemingly perfect ally in Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Israelis on the left of the political spectrum have found themselves increasingly on the margins, leading some to ask how much a liberal opposition still exists in the country. Well, joining me now to talk more about that, as well as Israel's position on the Iran nuclear deal, is the former Speaker of the Knesset and a voice of the Israeli left, Avram Burg. Avram Burg, thanks so much for speaking to us. You have been one of the staunchest critics of your government and your country, as you've witnessed it move further and further in favor of its hawks. First, I need to ask you what you make then of the developments of the last 2 days and the Netanyahu-Trump axis that has formed against Iran. Does it worry you?
There are two elements here. First, from Trump's declaration yesterday, or announcement yesterday, it's a game changer. If at the beginning of the conversation it was Obama and the Europeans on the liberal progressive side versus the Israeli conservative side, now all of a sudden it's conservative America, conservative Israel, some progressive in Iran, some progressive in Europe. It's a different game changer. And my feeling is if it will continue this way, it will go into a total impasse. And therefore there is a need, there is a call for a different kind of leadership or another kind of a voice or leverage in the process, and two might supply it. One might be President Putin and the other one might be President Erdogan. It will be very interesting to see if the game will be Israel and America versus Iran and Europe, or will other players move in. I hope they will, because there is a need for a responsible adult here, which the American president is not now.
But do you feel, clarify what you're saying here, do you feel that Putin and Erdogan could be the responsible adults to step in?
In a way, yes. In a way, it goes wider. Both Erdogans and Putin's are offering a very interesting alternative kind of leadership to the one we knew during the 90s and the last decade of the 2000s. Now it's a different kind of an international model, regional powerful players that they cannot stay aside while something like that so unstable is introduced into the local equations. It goes into Israel and Syria and Lebanon and the southern part of Russia and very immediate proximity for Turkey. They must be part of it. And if eventually it will end up with a kind of a regional conversation, a regional conference, a regional effort to have a Middle East clean of a mass destruction weapons, eventually Israel included, might be a very interesting positive outcome out of this negative policy, whimsy, childish negative policy of Trump.
Okay, it's a very interesting perspective. Let me first, though, I'd like to speak more about the global implications you're getting to here, but I want to also go to what's happening in your country, on the ground, where you are. You have spoken out. You've written books. You've advocated for a secular Israel that's less confrontational, and it seems like you've just lost every step of the way. Why have more and more Israelis moved against the Israeli left?
Let's first put it in a global context. You see this rising of local forces which are more xenophobic, self-siege, ethnical, rising all over the place. It's America for the Americans, it's the white supremacy in Hungary, it is some German right-wing political forces, it is Marie Le Pen in France. I mean, you see it, Wilders in Netherlands, you see it all over the place. There is a tidal wave of a very interesting, I will say, ethnical, political, right-wing, racist, global international coalition, and Israel is part of this wave. Within Israel, we have a prime minister that is in power for a long time, which is Mr. Netanyahu, that never mind how you look at it, his public support is only 1/4 of the constituency. Only 30 members of Knesset are members of the government's party. All the rest of the population, 75% of the population, voted differently. Now, Israel is a coalition system. It's not a presidential system. It's a coalition system, parliamentarian system. And the chance to replace him is not very remote. Yet, since the entire Middle East rumbles, the entire Middle East is, I will say, since the invasion of George W. Bush in his folly invasion to Iraq, brought down Iraq, brought down Syria, brought down, I will say, the entire 19th and 20th centuries understanding about the future and the borders and the nation-state relations of the Middle East. We are now in an era of transformation. Say to themselves many Israelis, not necessarily about Netanyahu, but say, if this is the Middle East, let's move a step backwards till it will stabilize. I do not share this opinion. I believe that there are a couple of forces in the Middle East which are very solid, very powerful, and not that corrupt. I will say, when you look at Iran and Turkey and Egypt and Israel, I will say you have players. When you add to it Jordan, Morocco, and some other elements in the region, you can have a very interesting, different coalition of stability, but it depends what you want. If you are right-wing Israelis, that the only thing he or she has in mind is, never mind what's going on around, let's occupy the occupied territories at all price, so you don't move forward. But if you're somebody like myself who say, listen, there are opportunities, I would have jumped on the opportunities the Middle East offers nowadays.
Okay, but Avram, I mean, I have to address some of your critics here. They say that you are basically a leftist, anti-Zionist extremist that failed to find the middle ground. And in turn, you've led the Israeli people, you know, further to the right and alienated yourself.
Listen, I'm awful. I'm untrustworthy, well-poisoned Trojan horse, stabbed the back of the nation. I'm an awful individual. I'm a pariah. Okay, so put me aside, but face my opinion. Put me aside, but argue with my arguments.
I've spoken to too many Israelis whom I trust that don't agree with that. So go ahead.
Do you really think, listen, do you really think that I care what people gossip about me? I care about argument. Now, when it comes to win an argument politically, I'm no doubt, or people like myself are no doubt are not there. But the kind I believe, the kind of politics I believe is that you're not in power forever. So the role of people like myself is not just to sit down and mourn about the fate and how bad it is, etc., but to prepare the tools and the containers and the alternatives and the new paradigm, which is beyond partition, which is beyond conflict, which is beyond animosity, to the day in which more and more people will wake up and say, wow, this Netanyahu conservative passivity took us to such a limbo that we have to walk away. The minute the public will turn around and public's turn around, I will be ready.
Okay. In a second, I want to ask about your time scale on that. But first, I have to ask you about what your immediate fears for Israel are. Whether you like it or not, the people who are in power in Israel are in power. And when you see you've got laws pending that give your prime minister and your defense minister full authority to declare war, Israel has already taken military action in Syria, some say very necessarily, to fight Iranian militia there. Do you think Israel is in genuine danger at this point?
I hope not. I think we should make a very clear distinction between the populist incitement coming from the mouth of some of the right-wing extreme politicians who try either to introduce themselves into the evening's news show or into the headlines or some populist social networks, and the deep, responsible approach of the military establishment, of the other security and political in a mechanism which prevented Netanyahu a couple of years ago to go openly against Iran, which prevented Netanyahu and other prime ministers to go all out against Gaza and smash it the way the defense minister said he will do in 48 hours. There are deep, quiet, solid, responsible forces in Israel that maybe they are not in the elected external extrovert power, but they are the real power you can trust.
Okay. You have said, though, the right is dismantling Israel. If that's what you want, go for it. We'll reassemble it after you've gone. Now, that was over 2 years ago when you wrote that in an opinion column you published. The right is still rather firmly where it is. So what's your time scale?
Listen, I personally am not in the game now. If you ask me when I want to change happen, I will say tomorrow morning is quite convenient for me.
But realistically,
if it will take longer, but if it will take longer, I will say something personally, but I say it as a strategy. I'm a marathon runner. I'm physically a marathon runner. And I have a lot of patience for a long distance. Nothing in politics, especially modern politics, as whimsy as it is, nothing happens overnight. It's about processes, it's about patience to prepare alternatives. I believe that by the end of the day, the decision of Israel will be, or decisions of Israel will be, yes or no, the occupied territories, yes or no, secular state or a religious state, therefore separation between church and state, yes or no? State for the Jews only, or state which belongs to all of its citizens, the Israeli, Arab, Palestinians included. I belong to the left-hand side, which is liberal, progressive, social democrat, who eventually, I've no doubt, introduce or offer the people a better collective good than the introvert, almost claustrophobic one offered by Netanyahu and his cronies.
Avram Borg, unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us with your perspective on the Newsmakers.
Thank you very much.
Well, after ETA's declaration to disband, Spain now has to decide what to do with the former members of the Basque separatist movement. Its violent campaign for an independent state killed hundreds of people. Now defeated after 6 decades, many former fighters are asking to go home. But what awaits them might be a prison cell. We'll discuss whether there's room for reconciliation in Spain in just a moment, but first, this look back.
ETAk berriro nabarmendu nahi du euskal eragile politiko, sozial eta sindikalei erantzukizunez jokatzeko. ETAk berriro nabarmendu nahi du euskal eragile politiko, sozial eta sindikalei erantzukizunez jokatzeko deia.
ETA has been defeated by the rule of law and by the strength of Spanish democracy. The only architects of peace are the thousands of police, judges and lawyers who have helped the terrorist group to recognize its failure.
I feel sad because all these years of terrorism have been for nothing, and it has been very painful. I don't think there can be any peace until justice has been served.
Joining me now is Andrew Dowling. He is a senior lecturer in Hispanic Studies at Cardiff University, and in Barcelona, Carlos Silva. He's a senior member of the pro-unity political party union, Progress and Democracy. Thanks both so much for joining us. Andrew, I'll start with you. I mean, why did ETA actually make this decision? Had it just been too many years of fruitless battle, or is there more political strategy to it?
I think it's an element of both. I mean, certainly for a long period of time since the 1990s, ETA has been on a kind of downward spiral in terms of its capacity, really, to carry out violent acts. So they've been diminishing year by year. There has been a kind of a slow burn, if you want, in terms of a peace process that was partly inspired by what was going on in Northern Ireland. And the fact that we haven't seen any violent incidents associated with ETA since 2011, I think what's happened this week, if you want the actual complete disbandment of the organisation, is kind of like the confirmation, the end point of a long downwards process where essentially carrying on makes no sense at all.
Carrying on as ETA, the militant movement that it was, makes no sense at all. But what about politically? Is there still a role there to be played?
Well, One of the principal demands for ETA, which emerged in the late 1950s, was the independence of the Basque country. And there's still, there's still a strong degree of support in the Basque country for independence. It's a minority trend. Figures vary between 30–40% of the population in terms of the polls. But what ETA has done, in a sense, they've decided that it is no longer, if you want, strategically of value to continue with a campaign of violence, and that they support the political process, they support a political road to achieving of independence. So again, I'd bring in the parallels with Northern Ireland. Irish republicanism abandons what they call the armed struggle and says, we're going to aim for Irish unification through the ballot box, through peaceful means. And I think the same policy is in place with ETA, that we're abandoning violence, we're abandoning armed struggle, but we're going to continue for the goal of an independent Basque country through democratic mechanisms.
Okay, so Carlos, is ETA gone as far as you're concerned, or is it just rebranding? And is there room in that case in the Spanish political landscape for a party, a political movement that's associated with former ETA members?
Well, I think that's the key point in the whole issue. I think that one very important, essential battle we mustn't lose now in this 5-decade war against terror is that of language and that of the narrative. I think that we must listen to the victims, and we mustn't pay much attention or be distracted by the noise of the terrorist propaganda. I think that they're trying to portray themselves publicly in front of the international opinion as political actors that are trying to reconduct the strategy and to change to a different stage and becoming from having some legitimate goals that now they want to defend politically, and that is totally unacceptable. I think that they have caused great pain in the Basque society and also in the Spanish society, and they have tried to achieve that by submitting that society to terror and to death for 50 years, and it's totally unacceptable that now they pretend to become political actors in a. Okay.
So you're saying ETA, as a militant organization, is not welcome, but what about those who are not militant, were not part of ETA, but that still sympathize with the Basque separatist movement, or I should just say the Basque.
Could I come in?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Firstly, ETA emerged under conditions of the Franco dictatorship, where there was no political route to either democracy, there were no legal parties, there were no legal elections. ETA emerged as its campaign of violence in the late 1950s because Spain was a military and police dictatorship, and Spain didn't stop becoming a police and military dictatorship in the 1970s. Yes, absolutely, there are victims of ETA, but you should also remember that ETA's caused over 800 victims. The Spanish security forces, the Spanish police, other organisations associated have also killed over 350 people since the middle of the 1960s as well. So those people are also victims as well. It's a political conflict. They're not just terrorists. It's a simplistic argument to say that we're just dealing with terrorism and all we should do is just lock them up. That never solves any political conflict where violence involved. It's a violent conflict where terrible violence has happened, just like, completely referring to the case of Ireland, terrible violence has happened, but the British government in the peace process in Northern Ireland released the prisoners on both sides because they recognised it was a political conflict.
Understood. And that was what I was getting to with Carlos there. Is Madrid going to have to reconcile with a movement in the Basque country that is about independence and gaining independence peacefully?
Well, I don't agree with Andrew in the fact that it's a political issue. The terrorists molded society to and submitted society to the terror. So there were more than 100,000 people who had to leave the Basque country. So they created a society and created a situation that must be reconstructed. So they can't gain any benefits from stop killing people. I mean, all the ideas can be defended in democracy, and I want to remember the audience that most of the killings of ETA were done during democracy in the 80s, and late 80s and early 90s. So I think that they can't go unpunished after 50 years of violence. They can't try to become a political party. There are other political ways, other political means to defend all kinds of ideas in democracy, but you can't pretend or try to get some benefit and just say that there were two parties involved two legitimate parties involved in a conflict, which is absolutely true. That's part of the terrorist propaganda.
Okay, Andrew, if I can, let's talk about then the independence movement within the Basque country today. ETA related or otherwise. If they sympathize with ETA, I think that's kind of beside the point right now. Let's look forward politically. And does the fact that separatists in Catalonia got as far as actually holding a referendum on their independence have anything to do with what ETA is doing today? Or, at the very least, are those who are independence-minded in the Basque country take inspiration from what they're seeing in Catalonia?
I think, yeah, things have certainly shifted. You know, if we were talking about nationalist problems in Spain 10 years ago, or in the 90s or the 80s, we would have been talking about the Basque country. Things have changed. In the past 10 years, essentially, it's been Catalonia that has risen to an incredible degree of prominence, you know, and on global attention, really, in the autumn of 2017. And the Basque country has gradually diminished and you know, moved away from international media attention. So those, answer your question specifically, those supportive of independence in the Basque country are very much looking to Catalonia today to see how can we proceed, how can we build a movement for independence, and are absolutely inspired by what's happened in Catalonia and how far they've gone, even though they haven't achieved independence, of course, but they've advanced in one sense further than the Basques were ever able to, even with a violent campaign behind them.
That is something that the terrorists have in mind, you know, that the Catalonia process has opened to them the possibility of achieving their goals by other means, not just killing people. But what is unacceptable, or there is a way that they can definitely abandon violence, and that is by also helping to solve all the more than 300 crimes that are unsolved, and to show really to show that they really regret the damage they've done. But I agree with Andrew that the Catalan example has been is something that the terrorists have in mind.
Okay, other than the terrorists, though, let's just talk, Carlos, about those who are looking for some sort of greater autonomy or independence for the Basque state. Is it fair to conclude that Madrid will do everything it can to make sure that the Basque people will not follow Catalonia's model?
Well, as regarding the fact of achieving greater autonomy, that's absolutely impossible, because the Basque country is the region with the highest level of autonomy in the whole Europe, and one of the regions with the highest levels of autonomy all over the world. So the only next step would be to grant them independence, and that's absolutely unnegotiable. Right, for Spain, right?
Okay.
Spain is based on the dissolution of its territory.
Go ahead, Andrew.
If, for example, 60% of the Catalans or 60% of the Basques, if there's ever that substantial support for independence, would Carlos accept Catalonia or the Basque country being independent with 60% support, 6-0?
Unlikely.
As a Democrat.
Carlos?
Yes. I think that the main problem with that reasoning is that nationalists present that percentage of people supporting independence as a natural process that comes up spontaneously from society, and that is really that's the simplistic thing. To believe that is something that has happened from one day to another. Right? There's been a very long process of manipulation, of creating a state of opinion in both the Catalan and Basque in societies by the successive nationalist governments, and also
so
a really
yes or
high
no to
investment in the. I'm answering the question. So that will be, okay, we could talk about that only after a period of neutrality of the institutions that should last at least 30 or 40 other years, right, to reconduct society to a really natural, if you want me to use that word, situation. So to negotiate with pro-independence parties in the present situation, or in the situation created in the Basque country, where, as I said before, more than 100,000 people had to leave the Basque country because they were threatened by the violence and the crimes of ETA. Then to start a negotiation, departing from that situation, from that point, that's absolutely unacceptable, okay. Right? That can't be the case.
I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time.
Поздравляю вас с Днем Победы, с праздником, который всегда был, есть и будет самым дорогим, священным для каждой семьи, для всей нашей огромной страны.
Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Iraq prepares for its first election since the defeat of Daesh. How will the country judge Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi's time in office? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.